Back out by Jamie Baker. Yuskevich wheels it back in. Lindros lost. Archibald takes him out of the play. Up with it is Recchi. Walks in front. Shot one, knocked down. Rebound, score! Lindros!
Hey everybody, it's Isaiah, and I'm here with Chef B, who's going to tell us about one of our sponsors here. Chef?
Yeah, O&B Puckcast is now brought to you by Summit Public Adjusters. The winter months can be especially hard on our homes, from roof damage and peeling siding to frozen pipes and toilet overflows. Call Summit Public Adjusters before you call your insurance company. Dealing with your insurance company can be stressful and confusing. Let Summit Public Adjusters take the stress out of the claim process by having our guys work for you. Get the most for your money and your repairs. The next time the big snow or the rain leaves you with some home damage, contact us for a free consultation. Summit Public Adjusters are licensed in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Learn more at summitpublicadjusters.com or call 215-752-0560. Just tell them that the chef sent you.
Yeah, what was that number again, Chef?
215-752-0560.
That's terrific. All right, we're going to carry on with the rest of our show. And we are back. It is Isaiah, and you are back on the O&B Puckcast. I'm still in shock. I'm hesitant here. It's episode number 179 because something went down. We were talking about our last episode, and boom, there it was. Whoop, there it is. And Chuck Fletcher's out of here. And I'm glad we waited. We were going to do a show right away. And then we had the opportunity to listen to Danny Briere speak yesterday morning. And I think if he didn't crystallize things, I think he clarified some things. If you're not sure, just ask Dave and Dan. Little hint there. So, yeah, before we get rolling here, the great Dan Silver is coming back from a trip from Jamaica. So if he can Jamaica it, that would be great. If not, we have with us back from a medical leave, Chef B. How are you, man?
Feeling much, much better. Nice little couple procedures done, and I'm raring to go, baby. I'm jumping at the bit. Let's do this.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, just a reminder, the O&B Puckcast is on 12 or 13 podcast platforms, including Apple, Spotify, iHeart, TuneIn, Deezer. We have a YouTube page. Just plug in there, O&B Puckcast. And we have a Facebook page. Same deal with that. Yeah, we really appreciate if you would subscribe to whatever platform that you like. It moves us up the charts when people are looking for Philadelphia Flyers podcast, which, of course, we are. You can follow us on Twitter at O&B Puck. At O&B Puck on Getters, our backup plan at O&B Puckcast, at O&B Puckcast. And next time we get a rating on Spotify or Apple, we'll read that on the air. It's a 5-star, of course. That's what we need. We appreciate it. And without any further ado, from 97.3 ESPN, yes, he is back. It is Kevin Durso. And Kevin, man, it went down. It's like I wasn't even sure I wanted to do the show anymore if they didn't do what they did.
I hear you there, and what a crazy week, huh? You know, we went from talking about what we did a week ago with the way that, you know, the deadlines in the past, and as we were speaking a week ago, it just seemed like we're far enough along in this season that anything is going to be an off-season formality at that point, right? And apparently there was a way for it to be about time and something that had to give. And that, you know, that week that we discussed, I think, you know, maybe probably in the moment that we were kind of breaking down the 5-6 days that led to last week's show, I think that was really a breaking point and an eye-opening week for a lot of people. And that's why we're here.
Yeah, let's trace the lineage of it. I mean, if you think about some of the statements of Chuck Fletcher, whether it goes back to his lack of communication, his inability to push back against the guy he reported to, and he told us I report to Dave Scott, and just he said it like a mantra, like there's just something up with it, as if he was trying to say, hey, you know what, my hands are kind of tied. But we go back to the aggressive retool. We think about some of the things like the contrast with Tortorella in I think it was in December. Tortorella's talking basically it's a rebuild, and then Fletcher goes and he talks about, well, we're only 5 points out of a playoff spot, whatever it was, at a time when they were really down and out, and it just didn't sit right with people. And then, coming in closer to what we were talking about last week, and just talking about the fifth most improved team overall, and then the total failure of deadline day, and then the season ticket holder meeting where he more or less said he was afraid to use the word rebuild and he was getting booed and all that. You combine that with a 50% improvement or uptick in comp tickets, the number of season ticket holders who weren't going to re-up, who hadn't re-upped. You put it all together and you look at two aspects of this, Kevin. You think about the timing of it. It seems obvious it was planned. Kevin, Chuck Fletcher was a dead man walking, but they seemed to move it up in response to the fans, and their outrage. And you in your first article after that, you cited a note of caution in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, because, it was very much, and one of the lines I've used a lot lately is being, teams that are proactive versus reactive. And this was totally reactive to the response of the week that was. I mean, they did this because they felt like they didn't have a choice other than to make this one particular move. And I've always, I've really been trying to stick to a message of everything that happens from here, everything that not just Chuck Fletcher, but everything that was going to come of this supposed possible change. And we had talked a little bit about some of the noise that was starting to emerge as that week went on and the deadline passed. There was just a sense that, or at least for me, the message to me has always been, this is going to be the first step, or it has to be, at least. It may, if in their minds it's the only step, then we still have problems if we're talking about that. But it should be the first step. And I think that, interestingly enough, the way that the reaction was made the first step speed up a little bit. There's no better time than the present, I guess, to everybody else. And I think that, I think the interesting thing is we kind of get out of Friday and the news of Chuck Fletcher and move to everything with Danny Briere and kind of what happened as Sunday's presser happened and all of that, is some of the answers that Briere gave, I think, shed some light onto where some of these things may be going, because he mentioned certain things that I think he did to one degree he did with some caution, but to another degree he did with the uncertainty of what's to come. And I think that's a big theme here as we move forward, is that uncertainty is a key word. I don't think people know what to expect anymore because they're heading down this path that Briere finally admitted to, and that seemed like everybody finally came to terms with, but Briere really laid it out and said it. And now that they're into this, now that verbally they're committed to it, the next thing is to see how much action wise they're committed to it.
Sure, Chef.
I think, and this is a personal opinion, this is probably looking at everything else that's out there, I think their total game plan was not to address anything else till the end of the year and let Chuck ride it out and take one for the team. Unfortunately, there was going to be like a protest that was lined up somewhere, and everything that happened in along the way by the season ticket holders press conference, all those other little things that added up. I think, in all honesty, it was almost like a mercy killing, because they just Chuck had taken, and they knew at the end of the season, I'm pretty confident everybody knew that they probably would be parting ways with Chuck. But the problem is, at that point, he's just sitting there, like you said, like Isaiah said, dead man walking. But at this point, they were doing him a favor by letting him go. He was just up there getting getting it was like throwing in a towel. I know he's a big boxing fan. This was throwing a towel in the match there just to get him out of the ring, because it wasn't. I mean, by all accounts, he's a very nice, personable guy and all that stuff. And I think everybody who was involved in this decision just felt bad for him.
Very much so. I think one of the lines we talked about, because Tortorella had said it Saturday in his defense of Chuck Fletcher, the day after the deadline, that he's had, the darts chucked at him. And I've kind of said that, he's very much the guy who's on the front line. If they do something, his name's on the release. That's, you're the general manager and you're the president of hockey operations. Whether you were the main influence behind the decision or not, it doesn't matter. Your name's the one that's on it. So I think that's what really leads to, that's what really leads to the idea that he's the guy who gets all the attention, that he is the guy who gets the darts chucked at him, because he's on the front line of it. And I think that's, I guess, the guys on the front line kind of always are the first to be eliminated from the picture before you really get to the heart of the matter, I guess. So, and that's why I say cautious optimism, because sure, everybody associated Chuck Fletcher with this era and with what's been going wrong. And there was nothing that was going to change that. He had too many missteps along the way, but it's only the start of it. And I certainly last week when I was on, I hope that I expressed that before we even knew that Chuck Fletcher was definitively out the door, that there was going to be there was a deeper issue than that. And that still remains today, but at least there's some uncertainty about it. The idea that you're going to go into a new structure of leadership and hockey operation structure, that's all good language, but let's see how they follow up on the language with their actions.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is, you can say rebuild. I mean, under Fletcher, it was almost like, if you remember the children's fable, Rumpelstiltskin. You couldn't say it. It's crazy. It's like Fonzie trying to say wrong. I don't know. I just didn't get it. And I think it had a lot to do with Scott and the dictates for management. And you can't be that way. You can't have the coach undercutting you and being the alpha male and when you're the person who's supposed to be outlining a vision. That's old territory. We're past that. Chuck Fletcher, God bless him. Probably definitely an amiable guy, very well respected in the league for how he comports himself. But this is the worst shape the franchise has ever been in, and we're moving on. And the thing that's really interesting, I think, and this is something Jason and Bill Meltzer were talking about on Jason's show last night. This hockey operations hire, I just, this is such an important hire. What they really need is a mentor, because if they don't have that, if they have someone who's kind of like Briere's peer running this, with the lack of experience that Danny Briere has to be a GM, whether he has a talent or not, it's not good enough. There's nothing better than experience. If he has somebody who's, walked that path and been successful, and we talked about this on the last show, then things start making sense. They stop putting the cart before the horse. We don't have another scenario where someone at a lower level has actually either more power, is better at communication. It's just everything is in line. And we listened to Friedman and Marek today, and it sounds like there's a lot of changes in the offing. We're going to get into that a little bit, but Chef, you got a question?
Yeah, I was going to say, since we're on this certain position, you've all heard the names that were thrown out there, former players, and to be honest with you, I was befuddled by some of them, because I don't see how, like Isaiah said, you have to have somebody with some kind of experience in that. It seems like, and I will probably say with a little bit of confidence here, that looks like Danny's going to be the GM, and that they're going to split the job. And I love that. I love the fact that they're going to split the job. I always thought it should be. The problem with people over the years where they have had nobody say no to them, or high up in places, has always resulted in catastrophe and everywhere else, and any position, not even just hockey. So if you're going to look at somebody in that director of hockey ops or president of hockey ops or whatever, it needs to be somebody with a background. I don't care how much, and I would, You love Lindros when he was here, or whoever else, Keith Pronger.
Chris Pronger. Yeah.
Chris Pronger. I just don't see it that as irrational. You're coming from an area of, if you look at this team, it's all messed up right now. You need somebody to come in, and somebody's got to be able to start picking and sorting out this mess that it is, because it's going to be extensive and it's going to take a couple of years. We've already heard that. So I'm not very comfortable so far with any of the names I've heard as who's going to be a president of this organization.
Well, let's take it from the very top. One of the things Danny Briere discussed, and then we'll go down to the president and then some of the people that might be in Briere's orbit as assistant GMs or in a so-called sphere of influence. But it sounds like today, if you listen to 32 Thoughts, then Jeff and Friedge were talking about how it looks as if that Dan Hilferty is going to be assuming a bigger role, even to the point where Dave Scott might be kind of eased out going into, quote, retirement by the summer. And I think that's a real big deal, because he was the glue for what was going on at the top of the organization. Kevin?
Yeah, I think so. And that's a big step in this, I think, because, that was one of the interesting things that stood out about what Briere said, was bringing Dan Hilferty into the conversation a little bit, understanding that a guy who kind of was an under the radar hiring about a month ago when that release came out, because the idea was, okay, they hired a new CEO, but the belief was he's not going to have much to do with the team. This doesn't sound like he's not going to have much to do with the team. If Danny Briere is saying, well, this decision is going to be up to Dave and Dan. Well, that doesn't sound like no involvement. Sounds like some involvement. And if Dan Hilferty can, if part of what he wants to do is get into Dave Scott's ear and say, maybe it's about time that somebody else take over that spot, that could be part of this. And so I don't think that, that noise is very legitimate. We'll just see if it actually comes to fruition. But I think that at the very least, I don't think this is Dave Scott by himself anymore. I think at the very least it's a tandem now, and you've got two people at the top. And on one hand, that can be a good thing, because we've seen that Dave Scott kind of needs the education about hockey and who he listens to and who influences him the most in those things. And it doesn't seem like Hilferty's going to be that kind of guy per se, but also the idea that bringing two people together could also create a situation of too many people. That could be one too many people who are sitting at the very top of your organization. So we'll see where it goes. I think the ideal would be if Hilferty thinks that the time is right and they convince Scott to retire gracefully and go out of the picture, then that might be the ideal situation. But it certainly seems like that's more of a distinct possibility than even just a few weeks ago when we were discussing where do they even go from here. Now it seems like there's kind of that Fletcher is the first domino to fall, and now we're listening to all the other things that could happen in the coming weeks.
Yeah, Fletcher was offered up as a red meat to the fans to stem the tide, and now the real movers and shakers at the very top are really going to take and mold this thing. So, and with it, and I believe, I'll go out on the limb based on what I've heard, I really believe they're going to try and smooth the path and make it look good. But ultimately, Hilferty, who is a self-described Flyers freak, is going to move in and take that CEO job and kind of take over those responsibilities. And maybe Val Camillo from the business side will be more prominent, but she's not a hockey person. Okay. And that's why you're going to have a president of hockey operations. But in between those separate groups are what are known as the advisors, the mentor or tutor of Dave Scott, who apparently did a horrible job. Bill Barber, God bless him, Hall of Famer. I followed him. I'm old enough to remember be a teenager when the Flyers won the Cup. One of a few people podcasting it can say that. I experienced all 8 trips to the final. So great job, but it really hasn't done a very good job for the Flyers. He's been influencing Dave Scott to believe that they could salvage this mess that should have been turned over by Ron Hextall. To be honest with you, he should have gutted this thing to studs, and who knows what would have happened. But things we're at where we're at. So from there, it's Bob Clark. Bob Clark, from what I heard, is basically mainly on the golf course, weighs in on the biggest issues, but doesn't really have a big say. It's Holmgren and Barber. And I've heard that Dean Lombardi is in there, but nobody's really sure what Dean does. I've heard that from somebody. It might have been San Filippo. Nobody's sure what Dean Lombardi does, and he wasn't interested in being president of hockey ops. He has his couple of cups, and maybe he's just kind of resting on his laurels, and he's on the fifth green right now as we speak. I don't know, somewhere in Florida. Those guys got to kind of get cleaned out. And I think the person responsible for that is a dual responsibility, whether it's Hilferty and the new guy that they hire who has to be the president of hockey operations. And I'm thinking someone who's along the lines of a Pat Gillick. I mentioned that last week. Or just how many people really know the GM, the actual GM of the Phillies? Most people don't. They think, well, there's some guy named McFarland or something. But they know Dave Dombrowski, and he's the mover and shaker. And if you want the pecking order, the way things should be in an organization that's modeled after apparently what the Flyers are going for, whether it be Colorado, the Avalanche, or the Bruins, which were mentioned today, but on 32 Thoughts, then that's what you need. I think that's what they really have to do. And some of the names are talking about, Robert Ashe has done a great job running Utica in the AHL, but, I don't know if he's really the guy I want to hire. Ed Olczyk does have more experience. Ray Shero has actually done some things in the league. He hasn't won on the Dog's Age, and now he's an assistant at the Wild. So we have Flyers connection, Jersey connection. That stuff doesn't matter. Can Ray Shero be a good mentor for Danny Briere? I don't know. There's other people I think I'd rather reach in and grab. And according to Freach and Marek, Kevin, this is a very highly sought after job. And to me, the proviso is, can I have that kind of Dombrowski, Gillick, Yzerman influence on Danny Briere? And if the answer is yes, you're going to get better people. What say you?
Yeah, well, and one of the things I agree about 1,000%, and I mentioned it when we did our latest episode of YWT yesterday, was, when you look at the dynamic of splitting the president role and the general manager role up, and it's two different people, a lot of times the general manager kind of, as much as he's still the day-to-day roster construction guy and all of that stuff, a lot of the big things that happen kind of tend to go, the credit tends to go to the guy who's the president. When the Phillies make a big move in the offseason with Dave Dombrowski as the president of baseball operations, Sam Fuld is the general manager of the Phillies.
Okay.
And how many people know who Sam Fuld is? Because every time something happens, Dombrowski's the one who gets the questions at the press conferences and his name is attached to it. And it's, oh yeah, Dombrowski did it again, because the guy with the bigger reputation and the larger track record and the higher standing position sometimes gets all the credit. Something that was mentioned on 32 Thoughts that I think, and it was kind of a split discussion when they were discussing this, because it seems like a conflict of opinion here between, maybe within the organization, maybe just from, people like Elliot Friedman and Jeff Marek, who were talking about it, the timeline of when this should get done or when they want it to get done. It is the most important decision you're going to make for your franchise moving forward at this given point. So I personally definitely see the benefit of taking your time to make sure you get it right. And that was the theme of their whole episode, was find the right person, right? Elliot said find the right human, which I thought was funny, but that the theme is get the right guy in place. And I think there's at least got to be a little bit of intrigue out there for, if it's that highly sought after of a job, then what happens if something else changes for somebody else between now and not even just the end of the regular season, but between now and the end of somebody's playoff run? If somebody suddenly becomes available, is that a guy that you would want to pursue and say, let's see about that as one of our options? Right now, all the speculation is off of who's available today. But there could be somebody who's not today that is available in another month or 6 weeks or whatever the case may be, that you may want to consider, and you may want to get in there and talk to, at least to see how interested they are, what their qualifications are. But the idea is, look, we can talk about, and one of the things I've seen a lot of is whether or not, former Flyer, whether it is or isn't, and how people react to that. None of that really matters in the long run. Get a guy in here who knows what he's doing. Get a guy in here who has enough foresight to move forward with the game. It's one of the things that I liked about Briere's press conference yesterday was he talked about observing the general managers that he's played for. And, Paul Holmgren's one of them. And I know, that the name that triggers some people right now in the world that we are, where we cover the Flyers and talk about the Flyers and all that type of stuff. But to go and say, in the last couple of years that I played, I was in Montreal and I saw Marc Bergevin, and I played for Colorado and watched Joe Sakic. Well, Joe Sakic seems like a pretty good example of somebody that you want to follow his lead on how to build a team. He just got a championship out of it. He just got another, in Sakic's case, he just got his third Stanley Cup ring because, and this time as an exec, not as the player and not as the captain of the team. So if that's how you're going to do things, and you're going to look at the guys who are able to provide that foresight and do things like that. And, I know that Yzerman is a name that we've touched on a number of times because of the fact that look at what Yzerman built in Tampa and what he's trying to finish building in Detroit now, to bring the Red Wings back to, back out of their rebuild and get them back into the playoffs, and not just in, but to contend. That's really the thing. And that's the thing about timelines with this thing too, is, enough, we've said, like I said last week, enough of the shortcuts, enough of trying to take the easy way out and patch it up and find an easy way to do this. You got to do it the right way, as Briere said in his presser. But doing it the right way means sticking to the plan and understanding it as a multi-year process, understanding it's not going to be quick, and actually following through with it, and understanding that for everybody involved, the timeline is going to be flexible a little bit. Somebody who's here today who you may say, this guy could be playing and come out on the other side of the rebuild. Maybe so. If it takes 3 years to get back to the playoffs, or 5 years, or whatever it is, maybe there is a guy who's on the roster today who you can say he'll be here when we're done with this. But you have to be willing to adjust that timeline for those players if it does take longer than expected. And a guy who you thought was going to be part of it becomes a trade chip down the line. Everything needs to be on the table when it comes to that. So, but the first big step of doing anything is making sure that the right guy is in position. And I agree with what you guys are saying. To me, Briere is he's definitely the odds-on favorite to be the GM. And I think that that's the role that would be better suited for him based on his experience level. Give him the general manager spot. If you think he's the best guy for it out of all of this, then give it to him and let him have that guy above him who is the more experienced and more, been down this road potentially, and can mentor him further than he's already been, because it sounds like he's a sponge in terms of what he wants to absorb and take in knowledge wise, but you can continue to enhance that even further with the guy you bring in for that president of hockey ops job.
Yeah, just one thing before Chef, I'll let you. This speaks to my point earlier again about putting the cart before the horse. By basically committing to Briere, and I don't mean this to sound negative, but from a neutral observer, in a way, you're saddling this candidate with a GM already in place and a coach already in place. And is that guy who comes in going to say, that's fine. I like Danny. Danny's got a good reputation, and I'm very familiar with John and what he's capable of, but I need the flexibility. If this isn't going to work after next year, that I'm going to have to make, some changes. And how much flexibility will that president have? And this is my problem. And this is probably why the Flyers are hedging their bet by calling Danny an interim, as clarifying as he was and as strong an opinion as he had for someone who is just an interim, as opposed to someone like Mike Yeo, a coach who knew he wasn't going to be coming back. So it's kind of a dicey thing. It's very Flyers-like to do things in this manner. I think so. The Flyers are trying to have their cake and eat it too. They want to keep Danny, who's a great talent around, who's thought of very highly throughout the league, but he may not be the guy who is a best fit, or may not be the one that the president of hockey operations would have in mind if he had the flexibility and freedom to do that. And you might be crossing that guy off your list as a result. Chef?
Well, I was going to say, I think that somewhat of what you were saying about that they were kind of filling this backwards, but also at the same time, don't if you're talking about doing this the right way, and how Danny says the right way, wouldn't it be smart, like to what Kevin was saying, leave your options open? I don't think that's a position you need to fill right now. I don't think so. I think that's something you could fill somewhere after the season is over, before the draft, before you start to get serious with the draft. You find a guy for hockey for that specific position, and then you work it if that's the way you're going to do it. It sounds like they're committed to Briere already. It sounds like it. And I just telling you, listen to Danny, and I think it was on. I'm not sure, but I listened to so many things the last couple of days, just laying there at home. But how confident Danny is, and how other people have picked up on that. Like, he walked in, like, as far as I know, it's, he's the owner of the Flyers. The way he was talking, the way he was like, oh yeah, everything seemed a matter of fact. He's handling it the way he's handled everything in his entire career. Like, I'm going to do this until you tell me I can't do this. And when you tell me I can't do this, I'm going to prove to you I can. So I kind of like that attitude of what I'm getting. I like the confidence. I like the kind of boom, throwing my balls on the table and here I am and look at me and that kind of thing. So it gives me hope. I like that. I like that I guess forward thinking and ballsiness. So I'm looking forward to it.
It's like Alec Baldwin and Glengarry Glen Ross, the opening scene. You know what it takes to sell real estate? Anyway, but I guess I had to see the movie. But anyway, let's talk about some of the people that might be working with Danny. It seems like, Kevin, they're going to keep Brent Flair around. Now, I'm not necessarily sure it'll be as assistant GM. It could end up, he could be moved to the head of scouting. What that would mean for somebody like Dave Brown, we don't know. There's discussions about people that Danny might be comfortable with. Ray Whitney, Shane Doan. I mentioned Robert Esch, maybe in some capacity, running that club in Utica for the Devils. And so, there's looks like there's going to be some changes, and possibly, and I think necessarily, a reevaluation of what's going on in Lehigh Valley, whether it's the coach, the development system, the model, whatever. What say you?
Yeah, so I guess I'll start with Flair first, because that's the first name you brought up. And, just because, Briere said he expects him to stay around, I didn't think it was a ringing endorsement, because I think it means that everything is still on the table for evaluation for another 5 weeks. I'm not saying I wouldn't be surprised, because I believe they do have a good working relationship, but I do think that I think what you have to look at is from an optic standpoint. I just see Brent Flair as so attached to the hip with Chuck Fletcher that maybe you end up, maybe somebody else decides, higher up than that, whether it's once you make that president hire, or maybe, depending on what happens at the ownership level, whether it's Dave Scott, Dan Hilferty, both, whatever, the case may be. If somebody decides, listen, just as much as Danny says that he's got a good working relationship with him, that he trusts him and all that type of stuff, the viewpoint of that would still be, he's been a part of this era equally as much as Chuck Fletcher has. Maybe the best thing to do is still cut ties. So I'm not convinced that Flair is definitively safe just because Briere says that's my expectation that he's going to be around. We'll see. I think now, at least, I feel like there's more of a chance of it than there was when the news of Fletcher getting fired came out. So that's as much as I'll say on Flair. In terms of some of the other names, Ray Whitney was an interesting one to me. I guess given, I understand he's got a relationship with Briere. That makes total sense. He was a finalist, or he was in the running for the San Jose job recently. That means that he's obviously gotten some regard around the league. I don't know if I don't know if that means that they're looking at him from a president standpoint, or if Briere would look to him as an assistant GM if the time came, whatever the case may be. I can't see Shane Doan leaving Arizona. I think he's got too big of a role there that he would leave just because Briere.
That's his whole community. He's
exactly.
He's really.
I mean, it's everything. He played there his entire career. He was, his son's part of the organization now. I just don't see it happening. I mean, I have no doubt in my mind that he and Briere are close, and that there's reasons why his name's out there, but I just can't see him leaving Arizona, given his connection to them and the league's overall dedication. I mean, it really, almost obnoxious dedication at this point to trying to make that franchise work as much as possible. I'd have to think Shane Doan is at the center of that in terms of being part of that for as long as he has. So I just don't see him being part of, and at least being that as interested as any, but as others for the Flyers job that would be open. Esh is really an interesting one to me. It mainly because of the fact that he has had the same role. Now he's had it in the AHL, and there's a difference between the AHL and the NHL, but you're managing a lot. Like when you're president of hockey operations, you're managing a lot of people. And I think that, given that Esh has to this point, roughly 10 years experience doing that exact role in Utica, 10 years of holding a position like that means you've probably managed a lot of people over your time. And you've had, I highly doubt that an entire hockey operations department at any level, NHL, AHL, whatever the case may be, has been exactly the same for 10 years. So it means you have to make decisions, and you have to kind of read the room and read the direction of a franchise. So he's an interesting one to me compared to some of these, because I don't think of him as a prototypical former Flyer. And so he's not that kind of hire to me if he were to get the job. And I think that level of experience is different than floating the idea, certainly floating the idea of an Eric Lindros, who, as far, to my knowledge anyway, he's worked a little, to my understanding, he's worked a little bit on the business side of things since returning to the Flyers as an ambassador, but not really, like, he has no connection to the hockey operations side at all. So that would be almost like, that would feel like, one of the things that's interesting about the 32 Thoughts pod and listening to some of that is that they keep saying Lindros being part of the organization, but they really don't throw out president. Like, I don't think they see him overseeing the whole thing, but I think they see him having some form of involvement potentially, which is intriguing. So I'll just leave that at that. And, obviously, we mentioned Olczyk and Pronger, and, I do think one interesting thing with Pronger is that he used to have pretty heavy involvement with Peter Luukko when Luukko left the Flyers and when Pronger's career ended, which is kind of interesting, because that would be an interesting look, kind of his path to getting here would be a really interesting one for how much he's gone through different organizations, just different way, different roles. For a little while, he worked for the league. You really kind of get a different education when you work in so many places. I think if you just stick to, I think that's one of the big things about why we keep having a discussion we do when it comes to the advisors and ownership and things like that. When you work for the same people over and over and over again, then the influence just, I think, tends to go naturally in the direction that they influence, because that nothing ever changes. But if you keep changing course for yourself and go and be a sponge, certainly like Pronger has over his post-playing career, and Briere seems to have been that a little bit. Now, Briere's done it a lot closer to the Flyers than Pronger has, but certainly I think that anybody who you can find, that's why I've said anybody who they hire really needs to be, just make sure you're getting the right person and look at everything. You don't have to just throw a guy's name out of the running because he's a former Flyer or he's an ex-player or whatever the case may be. That's the way that the league is. There's ex-players all over the place. So there's good odds it's going to be somebody who played before and then gets a job. But just make sure you're getting somebody who seems to have an understanding of a couple of things. And the couple of things for me would be an understanding of what the role is, understanding of how to handle a lot of people, because I think that that's a big part of this at this point, and understanding and getting everybody on the same page. And then making sure you understand the true direction of the franchise, which at least today, given who's running the show up front, coach and GM, interim GM, seem like they know what direction they want to go. They're speaking the same language now. Can you get everybody else to be speaking the same language in addition to that? That's really what you need to determine with that hire. And certainly, so I think they're starting to take the steps in the right direction for that. But you got to finish it off and do exactly what you're saying you're going to do, and see it through completely.
Yeah, absolutely. Just for the record, Chris McFarland, I dug that name out. He is actually the GM in Colorado, even though people talk about Sakic. So again, I mean, I'm not saying that one's necessarily a beta male, but like a Dombrowski, people are going to look at Sakic. Some people say that McFarland actually makes a lot of these decisions and Sakic's become more of a figurehead. Regardless, there has to be some kind of uniformity, like you're saying, in the organization, speaking with one voice without these disparate elements and essentially creating a disharmony that was crystal clear throughout the organization and unfortunately played out on the ice with the kind of player decisions that talk about dysfunction. The part I found the most interesting, other than the players that may be staying or going, and we'll get into that, was this feeling in Philadelphia that you had people from in the building at the executive level who were contacting people outside the organization and saying, hey, I wasn't on board with this move. I wasn't on board with that move. And at one point, Fried said, nuts. And I was thinking it had to be either the re-sign of Risto, the trade for Risto, or the re-signing of Sanheim, something, And this was the last couple years in Philadelphia. The talk was that this was happening all over. They were very afraid of where this was headed. So there's obviously a dysfunction that they're addressing and what they've known about for a while.
And you know what? When I heard that, and as I'm processing, hearing that happens and things like that, the two words that came to my mind immediately were, one, accountability, because that's where that message comes from. Then, because it means that somebody, you either do everything as an organization or you don't. And if you've got individuals who are trying to sit there and basically dismiss their name from, I wasn't part of that decision process, I didn't make that one, then that's not having accountability. That's trying to clear your name so you're not the one who's at fault and taking the heat for a move that doesn't end up working or whatever the case may be. But the other word that came to mind was entitlement, because that was a word that John Tortorella used recently. And I think that now that makes a lot more sense today than it did, even more than it did when he said it. In that, that wasn't even in a press conference. That was on a radio spot he did on 97.5. So to hear now, to understand maybe where he was coming from with that, where people are kind of, isolating themselves in the sense that I wasn't part of this one, or that's somebody else's responsibility. And that doesn't help with accountability, and B, that doesn't give you a clear sense of direction, because it means that somebody else is thinking, I would never have done that, but somebody else's voice was. That goes back to a lot of what I've said a lot, and probably over the last 18 months specifically. How many voices are in the room, and whose voice is trying to be the loudest? Because whoever seems to prevail in that probably is the one who's taking credit for the move. And the ones who didn't prevail may be the ones who are saying exactly those things, that it wasn't me. I'm not the one who was involved in that decision. It wasn't my decision to do that. And I think we can probably at least speculate which moves they're referring to. You mentioned the Ristolainen either trade or contract. You can take your pick on that one, but I would imagine trading and signing D'Angelo was probably part of that, discussion at some point. I would imagine that maybe some of the other contracts, or either contracts signed or that really active off season that Chuck had, that was where it was Ellis and the trade of Ristolainen and even Atkinson a little bit, because now I think you can start throwing in the guys where moves were made and the injuries have caught up, and maybe somebody sits there and says, well, I didn't advise for that because I was always worried about his injury history or something. Like you can revise the history if you're in that organization and say, I didn't advise this because look what happened. He got hurt and I knew it was going to happen, but nobody would listen to me. You can kind of create your own version of the story by doing that. So that's what I found interesting about that particular portion of what we were hearing was that if that's the way that things are happening, if that's the level of dysfunction, and another word we had said last week, this disconnect, which it very clearly sounds like there is, if this is going on, then if that's the level that it's happening at, that's why you need to make this move so correctly at this point, to get everything on the rails and really have your chain of command from the top down working the way it should. And I think that another interesting line that was used on 32 Thoughts was about how, in separating the two roles, a GM is going to probably, work closer with the coach and put together the roster and all that stuff. And the president of hockey operations is going to manage upward. That's an interesting line because, again, it's about managing people and understanding that everybody's on board with what your plan is. And it's very clear what their plan needs to be. And I think that you need to be encouraged by, again, this is a cautious optimism with Briere and saying, I'm not afraid to say rebuild. A rebuild doesn't have to mean this. I think all of these things, everything about that can be true. You just need to get everybody to understand that all things are on the table and the direction you're trying to go is improve the proper way. Get this thing back to where you build exactly as Tortorella was saying 3-4 months ago. Not even the foundation. Build it from the footers, foundation level, and then we'll go from there. And I think that's where everybody needs to realize that they are, is build it from the very, pretty much build the core from the ground up, even if there's a couple of players who you can sit there and say could be carryovers from today's roster to post rebuild, whenever that may be.
Yeah. Chef?
Yeah, well, I was gonna be what I was gonna say next. What do you keep? In a situation like this, and the big one is, well, I guess what you can get for Carter Hart at this point. And I know that they touched on it a little bit on a couple of podcasts out there.
It just came out today and said he's going to be available. That's a quote, I believe.
Yeah. So that's, and I think that's a little interesting too, because if you're going to keep young play, I think, what is he? Is he only like 24, 23, 24?
24,
is he 24? So he's technically kind of small, young enough to do a rebuild around, but I mean, the most I think that's going to be the most frustrating thing for all the Flyers fans is we finally get a goalie, maybe two, and you think you're going to be set for the next couple of years, 3 or 4 years, and then you have to go through all this crap again. I just would I would like to see like what each of us you say about going through this lineup and who's staying and who's going.
Well, why don't we do that? I mean, you look at Carter Hart. I think there's two sides to this coin. There's what the team would like to do and doing it. We're talking about building this the right way and being on a certain timeline. Right. And then there's Carter's viewpoint. Okay, let's put aside the Team Canada stuff and let's just assume that Carter has not had this weighing on him and he's just waiting to be cleared and cooperating with the legal, the legal authorities that are telling him, look, you'll have your time. We know you had nothing to do with it. Let's take the positive and say that is not relevant to this conversation. Knowing that there's an outside chance that whatever happened with Team Canada that's still under investigation could involve Carter Hart. I strongly don't believe that's the case, but okay, let's put that aside. Mm-hmm. Carter Hart might look at a guy like John Gibson and Anaheim and say, wait a minute, I got a year left. I'm going to be 25 in August. By the time I'm on my final year, I'm going to be 26. I'm in my prime, and I'm going to sign like a 7 or 8 year deal with the Flyers. And 2, 3, maybe even 4 of those years are going to be spent in a rebuild. And I've basically been rebuilding with a bad or mediocre team the entire time except for 20. Do I want to do this? Mm-hmm. And that's also part of the conversation. And if you go player by player, these are the discussions we're going to have according to where they're at their career and also with the contract status. So starting with Carter Hart, I think it's probably a good way to do it. Kevin, what's your opinion there?
So I put it two different, like the two kind of questions in regards to him. And again, just like you said, taking the Team Canada thing out of the picture, knowing that still is a lingering issue, but for the sake of argument, taking that part out of it. The big question is exactly that. Do you want to see the path through? Do you want to see this process through and be part of it going forward? If your intention is, I'm 24 by the time the contract's up, he'll be 25. He's got plenty of years ahead of him, but do you want to spend those years going through the rebuild, or do you want to spend those years trying to be on a playoff team and win? If his answer is no to being part of the rebuild, then I think that's when you seriously explore the trade. I agree, leave everything on the table. I'm not saying that you don't listen to anything that comes in, but I don't know that you're actively shopping him at 24. But I think that he's one of those guys that I kind of refer to with the timeline changes. If you start making progress and, as much as you can hope to make within a year, and the next contract comes up and he says, you know what, I like enough of what I've seen, I'll re-up and I'll do another mid-range deal. I don't need to go the 7-8 year route. I'll do 3, and I'll keep seeing it through for a little while longer because I like the direction that you're heading. That's up to the player at that point. But I think that that's where the timeline can shift. If this is going to turn into a 5-year process and we're still talking about building certain aspects of it, then I think that that's when it shifts and you start to really actively shop him, because now you're getting to the point where, okay, as you approach 28, 29, what's the likelihood he's going to be part of the best years, the real contention years, once you not just get out of the rebuilding and contend for a playoff spot, but really contend in the playoffs. That's what I think you have to do and be flexible to it. Today, I have a hard time directly just saying trade him today. But I think you listen. Depends on what kind of package you would get back in return. If it's not to your liking today, see where he stands and see how he feels. Because this summer is kind of equally as intriguing for him, because they can start to work on the next contract this year once this season's over, even though he's got 1 year left on the current contract. They can start to discuss that type of stuff. And I think so you're going to start having conversations about how he sees this thing. It's kind of an interesting dynamic for him, because the way my read on him is he wants nothing more than to win, but he also is a very team committed guy. So I think that that's the interesting part. What direction pulls him further? The desire to win and knowing that he can play at an elite level in the playoffs, no less, because he did it one time. But for him, that could be everything. Even if we haven't seen it on a regular basis, that 1 year for him could be the motivation of, I played that well that year and I can do this. And if I can just get the right situation, I could win the whole thing. So if he feels that way and this timeline doesn't mesh up with his beliefs, then I think you start to really explore it. But for now, I don't think he's at the top of the list of the guys who are going to move. I'll say that much, even if he is going to be, so-called available. Everybody realistically is available, I would say. It's just, how serious are you about making that, about pulling the trigger on the move that would send him out if he's still got a shot to be part of this on the other side?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, all bets are off if the Flyers win the draft lottery and get a talent like Bedard. I mean, that all of a sudden your line's altered, and then you can make a good case to trade him at that point would just be pure folly. But other than that, everything has to be on the table, and you have to look at some of the other contracts and some other way that the Flyers are going to be able to obtain a high-end talent. Chef?
Yeah, I was just saying, I was listening to Jason and Bill on their on Flyers Daily, and I thought it was interesting that Jason had brought up that the value for a goalie is kind of like not what you would get on a value for like a player, or a defenseman or a forward or a center. It says for some odd reason, a very good goalie doesn't have the same kind of return on the end of it. And I thought that was interesting. And then combine what Kevin just said. Do we see, this organization being that, I guess, nice or forward enough to consider the players' feelings in this, to say, hey, Carter, I know you hung in there with us. I don't know if this team should or have to take that approach. I think this is going to be there's going to be cutting a lot of wounds here on this team, and I think it can get nasty.
Yeah, just to interject, what's important to know is that after next year, he's arbitration eligible as a restricted free agent. And that really forces their hand. That's why it's a little bit more of an acute concern, because the Flyers could really get burned with a very big number at a time just when they're trying to get free cap-wise. So just wanted to throw that in there.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes the discussion doesn't have to directly be between whoever's running this show and Carter Hart, but directly. I think that his representation will have something to say about it too, and try to get the best for him. And that's why I kind of wonder. I don't think I don't see this as this offseason issue. Like I think that somebody would have to come to them with an offer more than they're going to go out and say, hey, listen, we'll give you Carter Hart. What's the best that you can do? I think it would be the other way around, that somebody would have to call and say, listen, would this be enough, or is this a starting point to discuss this? I don't see them actively shopping him, at least for this offseason. I think a year down the line, I think you're going to get a lot more information about the direction, because we're going to know more. We're going to know who the president of hockey operations is, who's supposed to run the show. We're going to we'll see whose influence is still part of the organization moving forward, and we'll have more answers. One of the things I said when we did our show yesterday on YWT was, if you're a team out there, I don't know how you can read into the numbers given what he plays behind and the win-loss record and things like that. Like, win-loss record for a goaltender is sometimes just as much a product of the team as it is the goalie. And he's stolen them plenty of wins this year in his own right. So I think if you're paying enough attention, if you're a smart enough guy in a hockey front office in the NHL right now, then you're seeing that he's got the ability to play. It's just a matter of seeing past that and going, what happens if I put him on my team with whatever the case may be, whatever you've got to play in front of him? How would that improve your team? But I don't think that there's any, or at least there shouldn't be, like it's like Briere said yesterday. I think you've got guys who are of value, and I think Carter Hart's one of those guys of value, because I think Briere would say that Hart is one of those guys, and Tortorella has already said as much, that Hart is one of those guys. So I think that you've got the coach and the interim GM on the same page with his value today, but I think you just got to see how the timeline meshes up before you make that move, and what happens with the contract and all of that type of stuff. That's really where it gets more dicey. I think, like, for the next year, you've got him for the next year at that 3.979 cap hit. So there's no mystery about what his status is going in next year. It's after that and what kind of takes place from there. So I think that that's the real case with him. And I don't think anybody in the organization should be sitting there saying, hey, we got a 24-year-old goalie who's capable of stealing some games, give up on him. I don't think anybody's trying to spread that message. I think that more it's just about how does his trajectory line up with the timeline of whatever the rebuild is, especially when you consider that the rebuild has so many parts to it, which is going to include not only the drafting and developing part of getting a core in here, but also shedding the cap space from other contracts wherever you can, whether it's by moving contracts or having guys who eventually just come off the books naturally, whatever the case may be, you have to get rid of some of this money that's tied up. And I don't think they're looking at Carter Hart as an issue in that in any way, shape, or form, other than whatever the next contract looks like, considering he does have the capability to play and be a starter in the league.
Yeah, that's certainly good points there. Obviously the Flyers are not looking to get rid of guys like Cam York, Owen Tippett, or Noah Cates. I mean, those are like the beginning of the structure of what could be called a core. But on the other hand, then you have players like Kevin Hayes, who clearly has been rumored to be leaving town. And it's going to be a tough decision about retention, because that's really the only way they're going to get rid of Kevin Hayes that I could imagine, how much they're willing to retain the conversations. If you can make him a $5 million second line center, then he becomes attractive. And he's only tied up for a few more years, and he's ready to go. He's ready to waive whatever no trade part of his contract that he has left. It was no move in the very beginning, so at least that's modified. Players like Provorov's been out there. I've heard mixed news about whether he wants to leave. They don't think it's going to work out. That this whole thing about who's going to take his minutes, now that seems less important now, because if you're rebuilding, that kind of stuff doesn't matter as much. Risto could be a guy who's rejuvenated to some degree. And of course, TK, they like him. They don't want to get rid of him. But again, you look at his situation, he's 27, okay? And he's going to be up for a renewal of a contract. And I'm looking for his contract. I forget he was on injury. Right, yeah, he's going to be 27, 26 right now. And he's got 2 more years after this at 5.5. That's an attractive player for a contending team. And if he's going to be up for a contract for 26, well, I mean, he's really shown what he's made of. And he would look very good on a first line with a real star, or certainly a second line filling in a role for a contending team. So there, you could go down the whole entire roster, but I mean, I think certain guys are not movable until they prove they can play, like Farabee, Couturier, Atkinson. So they're kind of stuck in that regard. And I'm not saying I want to get rid of all of them, but I'm just, I think that's being realistic, Chef.
Yeah, it's interesting you brought up Farabee because he takes a huge hit on Twitter from the fan base. Like, get rid of him. He's done. He's all that. But if you listen to a wider scope, like the national guys, especially the game the other night, the one that was on ESPN or ABC or something like that, they were talking about how the way they were looking at it from. It's like they're acknowledging that he had surgery and came back a little faster, and he's shouldering a little bit of a burden. And I understand. Torts has mentioned that this is not an excuse. It shouldn't be an excuse for him, but I get it. But it weighs on every player. I think that this is a tough year for him. I think him coming back, whether or not he came back too early, is here neither here or there. He played, but I think he's now. Just showing, I think he's more comfortable in his skin, trusting his body more. I think is probably a good choice of words for him on these last 5 or so games. He's really been in there on the forecheck, and he's actually making contact. He's initiating contact. I know that's always been a knock on him. Isaiah's saying that. But he's actually initiating contact when going into corners and going out of his way. And he's not afraid to stick off for himself anymore. So I'm thinking hopefully we'll get a very different Joel Farabee next year. And hopefully he'll be back to the form he was the year before.
Yeah, I think Farabee's been chasing it all year. He probably came back like 6 to 8 weeks too soon, trying to, impress the new coach and kind of put that injury behind him. And it's like chasing a game. It's never his conditioning was never there, and he's not a big bulky kind of guy. He needs to be really in good shape and have his strength together before he gets into a training camp. And he didn't have that chance, and he learned a lesson. It certainly made it tough on everybody. So, like Elliot and Marek were saying, the Flyers are back in the league news, and the NHL is a better place when the Flyers matter. And as we go along, it seems as if people are going to be watching and talking about this team. But watching that president, I kind of maybe disagree with the two of you about the president of hockey operations. I'm real big on pecking order, and I think if they just get a manager, and Danny's really kind of calling the shots, and somebody like Ash comes in, and maybe I'm wrong about Robert Ash, but he's basically trying to keep everybody in line and all on the same page. I don't know. I just want someone to be there who has more experience, but we'll see. You get a strong personality. Maybe Chris Pronger. Chris Pronger is almost as rooted in St. Louis as Shane Doan is. I think him and his getting back to Pronger has a business. His wife has a travel business, and she always liked being in St. Louis. So that'll be interesting to see how that goes. But Kev, any final thoughts before we call it a wrap for tonight?
I mean, just like we've been saying, it's been an interesting week. It's going to be several interesting weeks ahead as we see exactly to what extent, what I believe it was, and I ran down this when we did our show yesterday that, there was an order of people who were putting out that Friday was kind of going to be this big day or whatever. But Jeff Marek had a tweet that was something about it could be a big day or whatever was in the tweet, and I quote tweeted it and put, let's see what big means, because is big rearranging some furniture, or is big bigger than that, like truly significant changes? And while there was only one change on Friday specifically, it sure sounds like the groundwork has already begun for more to come. That's important, and that's really, I think, the thing that's going to be most intriguing to watch once we get through the formality that is the remainder of the season. And certainly, it's certainly not a formality. It shouldn't be a formality for the players, and it shouldn't be a formality for Danny Briere, who's got an important job to do in these last 15, 16 games that are left at this point. But for everybody else, I think that there's just this sense that there's a lot of, and I know it's been floated around talking about that people should be nervous in the organization a little bit about their role and things like that. If you're not John Tortorella, who's pretty secure as the head coach, if you're not Danny Briere, who definitely has the respect and seems like he's got an upper hand in this GM race today, then you should be concerned about what your future holds. And that's as encouraging as we can be for today, I think. So it's a starting point. And I kind of have said that all along throughout the course of the weekend, that this is the start. Let's just see to what extent this sale is and this house cleaning is and all of that type of stuff, because it really needs to be more. And one of the things I kind of said, I know I put it on Twitter, was there's really no in between on some of this stuff. Like when it comes to maybe the advisors and things like that, I don't think that taking care of, saying one guy isn't part of this anymore satisfies a lot of people. I think you either need to do one or you're going to stick with the same thing that it's always been. And I think we know how the response to sticking with the way it's always been is going to go. There's a real demand for change out there. And that demand for change was heard once, because that's why Chuck Fletcher got fired when he did. But how much, let's see how much that demand for change has really resonated within the organization, and how humbled everybody really is by the way that the fans have responded, because it's gotten the attention of everybody to this point, but you've got to follow through and really finish with that reconstruction at the top before you can even worry about who's playing for the team going forward. I could care less about what we think about player-wise today, when there's a whole offseason ahead and you're not going to do a thing in the offseason until you know who's at the most important positions. You got to take care of business there before I can even think about anything that goes into what player gets traded or what player does not and stays through part of the rebuild. I'll get serious about what players stick around when we know more about who else is running this show. But that's certainly a good start, and that's where I think we can leave this one.
Yeah, absolutely. And just further to that point, but at the time that Anthony DeMarco, I think, was really the first one who had an inkling what was going down.
Yeah,
like
he had a late morning. Yeah, he had a late night, hey, something big could be happening in the next 12 hours kind of thing.
And he had an article like a couple of days before that something could be happening sooner rather than later. And to your point, with regard to guys that, in the organization that should be nervous, it was pointed out today that the move with Fletcher was expected, but the timing of it and the way it happened caught people off guard. They didn't know. In fact, the media knew when Olivia Reiner and Jana Hahn were actually adding the specificity of Fletcher getting fired. Mm-hmm. That caught Fletcher and some of these other people who you referenced may be nervous right about now, off guard. So I think that speaks volumes. Where can people catch up with you and your work and all that?
Yeah. So at Kevin_Durso on Twitter. The articles are over at 973ESPN.com, sportstalkphilly.com, YWT podcast. We had a long discussion last night, obviously, because there was a lot to talk about. And it's funny, our intention originally was we did a whole thing on the Flyers trade deadline the week before and said, okay, you know what, next week we'll talk about some of the winners from the rest of the league, because we're going to be into that mindset. And this news came out, and much like you guys, we didn't, we waited it out the same way and got lucky because of the fact that was when Briere happened to speak, and we could talk about what Briere had to say in the same vein. So, whatever, we got whatever's left of the season. Like I said, 15, 16 games, end of year. And then, my job's not going to slow down anytime soon after, because there's a lot of decisions that are going to be made this offseason. I'm sure of it. So we'll see where it goes, but that's where everybody can find me. And it was great joining you guys once again. Chef, good to see you again after seeing you in the press box a couple weeks back. It seems like we were both at a game. It was a big turning point for all this, because I think that all those Rangers fans got to people.
Yeah, I'm going to say that was the biggest point. I think that's where decisions were going to be made, and I thought, oh well, maybe we have to move a little earlier. And then the season ticket holders press conference after. I think I think it was you in between periods, dude. I've never seen so many away jerseys. So it was a sea of blue in there, and it was embarrassing. I had people hitting me up on Twitter saying, oh my God, can you believe this? I'm like, well, yeah, I can. This is what happens when you don't acknowledge your fan base. You just totally ignore them and just tell them you're retooling. And that, and Yeah, it's unbelievable.
Yeah.
Yeah. Kev, thanks so much. We're going to have to hit you up in the off season. Take a
Absolutely.
little rest and get ready, play the formality of these games, because that's what they are at this point.
Absolutely. It was great joining you guys once again, and thanks for having me.
All right, man. You take care.
You guys too.
Later.
See you.
Right. Okay, so Chef, I wanted to give you a full airing of final thoughts and views, because you weren't here last week and you didn't really have a chance, because I was hogging the mic a little bit tonight, to give a kind of summation about everything that was on your mind as we come to a close tonight.
Well, I was thinking, if they are cleaning house, and if you look down the roster, I mean, magically speaking, they're not unmagically speaking, they're automatically going to shed $10 million based on expiring contracts and what's out there anyway. So there's that's where you start, and then you got to figure out a way, and they got to do it the right way. I mean, my thing was, I knew that Provy and I knew that Kevin Hayes or even Sandheim, any of those three, and I think they're the three particular ones that keep getting brought back into the equation here. I never thought that they were going to be a trade deadline move ever, because I just didn't think they were going to let. Yeah, no, I know, that's what I mean. Well, in particular, I don't think they were going to let them. I just think that is a move to what you have said, and I think Dan Silver said it. These are moves that have to be done right. You can't be on the losing side of those. You have to get full value for what you get back for those three guys, and whether or not the value is there or whether or not we agree with the perceived value, but you have to get the most you can for that. And I don't think that's something you can whip up in 10 days before the trade deadline, especially when everybody started moving early and started shaking and moving, and all of a sudden you're like this. It's like high school when the Stairway to Heaven came on, and you're like, oh my God, I'm not dancing with a girl. You knew you were in trouble. It was just like, oh God, no, not. So you're going home alone again, and that's kind of like the feeling. That's what it felt to me, the trade deadline with Fletcher. It's just like, I'm sorry, Chuck Taylor, I should say. Yeah. Because that's what ESPN reported. That was kind of funny too. We didn't even talk about
Taylor,
that. It flashed on the tracker at the bottom of the thing. Chuck Taylor, Chuck Taylor fired from the Flyers. If you look, I think Terry Bundy, he tweeted it out. It was hysterical.
That was funny.
That was awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and if you want to argue with me on some stuff, I know I don't always see. I have a weird way of looking at things. So, but if you want to argue with me on stuff, I'd love to hear about it. You can reach me at Chef to Left B on Twitter. Chef, the number 2, the Left B. Fantastic.
Yeah, you can catch me on Twitter at Isaiah, ISAIAH _520. Isaiah, don't forget that _520. And of course, you can catch the O&B Puckcast at O&B Puck, at O&B Puck. Okay, we didn't give you any notice here, but a special announcement right here and right now. And I hope you're still with us. We are going to have a special guest later this week in an interview that we're going to record midweek with the one and only Eklund from Hockey Buzz. And don't underestimate how much he knows about the Philadelphia Flyers organization. We wanted to try and get him a little earlier, but he's tied up. He's got family situation. He's a great dad. I followed Ek through the years, and he's just a good guy. It started one way with his site, and now it's just like evolved into something else. And he's got great Hockey Buzzcast and everything like that. And we're really looking forward to having him on. I've never met him. I've messaged with him on occasion, but we're going to have him on. It should be available by Thursday or Friday. It's going to be an O&B special. So look for that. In between then, the Flyers play a couple games. They play the Vegas Golden Knights tomorrow night, and then they have a back-to-back at the Wells Fargo with Buffalo and Carolina. Very interesting games from teams that need some points in some cases, or they're just clearly better than the Flyers. So, and we carry on. But until then, everybody, take care.